I've heard some people describe the use of agents as not necessarily a handoff, but to think of it more as having a guardian angel or an expert on your shoulder.
Our customers, the way they think about it is I'm suddenly giving every developer in the world a pair programmer. And pair programming is a little bit of an art. We're in this together to solve this problem. You take these tasks, I'll take these tasks.
That could be another instance where the paradigm carries through in a positive way, that the governance, the security, the sandboxing, the permissioning based on KPIs, based on parameters that are preset, will guide this new creativity just like it would guide a software development in a traditional sense.
Guardrails versus gates. I think traditionally when we rolled out a technology, we created these hard gates where things couldn't pass from A to B without having this control point. Those boundaries are not going to work in a world where all of these roles are getting blurred.
You've been tracking and advancing the productivity of enterprise IT for decades, and you recently described agentic AI as, quote, bringing a joy of discovery I haven't felt since probably the iPhone.
I'm probably driving my staff crazy because I'm now bringing fully formed solutions to the table. But it's a level of, call it the inner loop. How quickly am I able to create and iterate on this stuff and get it out has been phenomenal. I think that's the biggest advancement I've seen. By the way, in just the last 6 months, 6 months ago, this wasn't even true.
Suffice to say that the status quo is not going to hold, so you might as well get ready for change. It's coming. Welcome to the Tech Transformed podcast, where we present a weekly conversation with the top people impacting the enterprise technology landscape. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host and moderator. I've been an IT industry analyst and prolific enterprise IT blogger and podcaster for more than 20 years. In this latest Tech Transformed episode, we welcome Rob Whiteley, CEO at Coder, to explore and unpack the changing role of developers in the age of agentic AI, specifically within cloud development environments. Stay with us now as we examine the challenges and opportunities presented by integrating AI agents into these powerful development environments. We'll also learn how organizations can best leverage this versatile technology sooner rather than later. Welcome, Rob, and thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
You've been tracking and advancing the productivity of enterprise IT for decades, and you recently described agentic AI as, quote, bringing a joy of discovery I haven't felt since probably the iPhone. This isn't about agents replacing coders. It's about 10 times the effect on the amount of software that we can write, you said. So given your long perspective and depth of IT experience, Rob, what trends and capabilities around agents lead you to this high expectation and even a sea change in how software is developed?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think we always hesitate in this industry to use transformative or game changer or pick your favorite cliche. But I've just found, unfortunately, those do apply to the very moment we're in. And to me, sort of the definition of these is the world different after the technology was introduced than it was before? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, only a few technologies like the internet, like a lot of the social media and mobile really kind of changed our lives. I think we're at that moment with AI, where it is at a point where it is able to dramatically change what types of roles I hire, what types of skill sets I look for in those roles, what my expectation is for productivity around knowledge workers in particular. And so for me, it's just that is the context. So I recently dove in, started using some of these tools, and they're just fun. You can actually interact with one of these coding agents and ask it to build you an application to solve a problem. And as an individual contributor, I can now do things without having to go to my IT department or a developer or a designer. I can actually just build that, and it's fun. It's a little bit of joy back in these are the types of problems I can solve. I'm probably driving my staff crazy because I'm now bringing fully formed solutions to the table. But it's a level of, call it the inner loop. How quickly am I able to create and iterate on this stuff and get it out has been phenomenal. I think that's the biggest advancement I've seen. By the way, in just the last 6 months, 6 months ago, this wasn't even true. That's how quickly this is changing.
Sure, the whole idea of just creating these great requirements and then handing them off to something that has autonomy and capability that has this ability to sort of run with it is very powerful. So, as organizations start to grapple with how to best exploit this and use this, how do they need to rethink their development strategies or even their culture in order to not be perhaps self-limiting in how they take advantage of these agents and their capabilities?
Yeah, I think what's really important is the shift in skill sets we've seen. So we're shifting from predominantly valuing hard skills to soft skills. So what do I mean by that? I typically wanted a developer who had software engineering skills. They had proficiency in certain tooling, certain languages, certain environments. And if they had that proficiency, I knew they would be productive and I could get the most value out of them quickly. Well, now all that's been replaced by a robot, somebody that has proficiency. And yeah, today that proficiency is that of maybe a 1 to 2 year experienced developer, but this stuff is evolving rapidly. I think we'll be by the end of this year at a point where it's as good as someone who has 5 to 8 years of experience. And so if I can rely on that hard skill to come from an AI entity, then I suddenly have to think, well, how do I coax the best result out of that AI? And that's where the soft skills come in. I have to set requirements. I have to set boundaries. I have to be very clear in what I want and how I want it done. I have to collaborate with many of these things. I have to think about how I'm going to break up, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly I'm acting a lot more like a manager than an individual contributor. And so to me, that's going to be the single biggest cultural shift is I'm looking for people right out of the gate that have managerial skill set, not proficiency in a particular language or tool. I can get that out of an AI entity. And I just think your average CTO or VP of application, they're not ready for thinking entirely different, especially if I'm used to hiring thousands of these developers. I think we're going to see a very rapid shift in kind of the demographics of how developer teams are built.
I've heard some people describe the use of agents as not necessarily a handoff, but to think of it more as having a guardian angel or an expert on your shoulder, so that they're always with you and that there's an interaction to getting the best out of what the people can do and best out of what the machines can do. And in the case of development, it seems to me that the humans can focus more on business process and understanding outcomes and looking for innovation in how the business operates and how people react to problems and solutions, and then let the agent do the coding and the ground work. So is that a good way to think about it, or how should we maybe adjust it?
I think that is exactly right. And a lot of our customers, the way they think about it is I'm suddenly giving every developer in the world a pair programmer. And pair programming is a little bit of an art. It's we're in this together to solve this problem. You take these tasks, I'll take these tasks. I think that's an important way to think about it. But not all companies are ready for that. For me to work with a pair programmer is a deviation from, hey, let me just go heads down and get my stuff done. And so what you really have to think about is similar to any junior or intern level skill set, it's an upfront investment. It's probably a net loss of productivity while I get used to it, while I train that person, while we figure out how we're going to get along. But once that entity is fully up to speed, whether it's a human intern or an AI agent, I'm actually going to get 10x more productivity working with them in that sort of collaborative pair programming way. And so I think a lot of companies have to think of it as it's an investment up front and the payoff comes down the road. And that payoff is going to be an order of magnitude better productivity, but it is a different mindset. And I think figuring out how to set that up, how to value that, how to incentivize it is going to be what most companies are working on probably through the end of this year and into next.
And then perhaps a third leg on that stool of this new productivity capability are what is intrinsic to the CDEs of what they're already capable of, particularly around issues of security, governance, cost, putting in those guardrails and assuming some of the infrastructure logic in terms of, parameters and KPIs and that sort of thing. So how do the three, the agent, the human factor, and then the CDE come together?
The way I think about it is I suddenly have this entity in my environment. It is an agent. It's a coding agent. It's a semi-autonomous being, if you believe in that I have to make productive. It's very analogous to what we've been doing for 20 years, which is hiring contractors. It is an untrusted third-party entity that I'm allowing into my environment, and I'm asking them, hey, get up to speed really quickly and start producing things for me. And the reason why I go there is because for the last 5+ years, we've been investing in this thing called a cloud development environment to create a safe environment for developers to come in, especially these kind of third-party contractors, get work done quickly and safely, and then hand that work unit off. And so although we probably didn't see the world of agentic AI coming, it ends up it's tailor-made for that exact use case. And to double click on that a bit, what do I mean make it safe? Well, if I'm allowing an agent, this kind of virtual contractor, into my environment, do I want to give them access to everything? No, I want it sandboxed. Do I want to give them access to all the code base? No, just the portion of the code base that they need. Do I want to give them access to all the tools? No, just a subset of the tools they need to complete that task. And so it's this kind of virtual sandboxing that I can quickly get them up to speed. And then, by the way, limit that. So if at the end of the day, they've created bad code, or maybe they introduced an error, or maybe it hallucinated and went off the rails, no problem. It was completely sandboxed and separate. That can only be done realistically and at scale in these cloud development environments. And so I think it's becoming the driving factor for a lot of enterprises to look at these over more traditional kind of local development environments. I'll end on this. Imagine you're a developer and you've got your MacBook and you've got your development environment, and then you suddenly invited 10 contractors to share that laptop with you. It would be a nightmare. Each tool would be different. Every environment would be different. There'd be resource conflicts. None of it can be done locally. It has to be done in the cloud.
And one of the other things I've been hearing is that folks who are experimenting with agents and trying to figure out the new landscape and opportunities are also interested in choice, that they don't want to get locked in necessarily, as has always been the case with new technologies. And when it comes to CDEs, how does that agent work? Is that your agent that you bring to the CDE, or do you look to the CDE to provide the agents, or some combination? How do we bring that contractor into the mix in a way that's satisfactory to the development organization?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because this technology is evolving so rapidly that the more hard-coded choices you make, in other words, you bake the technology into the stack, the more difficult this will be. It'll go stale very quickly. I mean, just last week alone, this frontier model leapfrogged this frontier model, and then over the weekend, yet another frontier model came and leapfrogged in terms of best of class. So really what I have to do is think about first principles. How do I create a secure environment where I can spin up any tool and connect any entity, human or agent, to that, so that that is as fast and safe as possible? That's one problem I'm trying to solve. And then I'm trying to make a separate decision on what is the best entity to attach. Is it a human? Is it an agent? Is it a human using agent? Is it a human using AI? That set of variables is going to be very environment specific. But in the case of an agent, I want the freedom to pick whatever agent with whatever underlying model gets me the best results, and be able to, if anything, almost do a little bit of arbitrage across that environment, so that I'm spinning up the right answer, the right tool for the right job. Again, very difficult to do when I'm not expressing all of this policy as code, so that I can just swap things out on the fly as needed. And that's really what I think we've seen cloud development environments are very good at, is I'm essentially expressing my environment as code, and therefore it is as programmable as the actual tools themselves, which give me that kind of flexibility.
Yeah. I mean, it's very easy to get sort of blue sky on this stuff and come up with some interesting scenarios. And so, for example, we could have an agent that we devote to saying being an auditing agent. Audit how this process is working out. Tell me whether my cost benefit analysis is on, or whether there are other alternatives out there that I should be considering. That might be a really great way to have the ability to have your open choices, not just something that your happenstance brings to you, but that your agents are actively out there canvassing for you, right?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really, really good point. Where we've seen the most success is I narrowly scope an agent to perform a certain set of related tasks. The more general purpose I ask these things to be, the more it's going to take creative liberties and try to please you as the human versus, hey, your job is to audit this code, test this code, document this code. Or even if we get out of the coding world and just look at Agentic and Possible, whenever I'm trying to do the same process over and over again, agents are great for solving that problem. And then just making sure it's scoped to do that, trained to do that. And then I'm just simply tuning it over time. And less that kind of let's just cast a really wide net and hope it can do everything a human could do, which they're not quite mature enough to do yet.
Sure. You know, Rob, both you and I have been around long enough that we remember when development in a cloud environment and even putting workloads up in a cloud environment had people scratching their heads and saying, is that going to be secure? I'm pretty sure my on-premises IT is going to be the most secure. So I'm going to be a little bit leery of going out into the cloud. And I'm going to guess that there's probably some of that thinking too, but I'm going to guess that just like cloud ended up being more secure, that the cloud hyperscaler providers were better at security than your IT staff, and they can extend scale and complexity to their advantage. Should we expect the same with agents, that we might expect that when we use agents properly with the right guardrails and sandboxing, as you say, that we'd actually have more secure, better governed, better controlled development and ultimately, the processes that result from that development?
I think it's a great way to think about it. The way I look at it is the insecure element of anything is the human. Social engineering is probably the biggest threat for out any of us. We take a good actor and convince them to do something inadvertent that exposes my data or my application or my customers. Agents are susceptible to the same problem. They might accidentally put credentials in that they shouldn't have, and suddenly everything's open. So the question isn't about preventing bad things from happening, but how do I remediate or stem that damage as quickly as possible? Centralizing that in a cloud where they have all of the best practices for access controls and encryption and credentialing and authenticate is the best way to kind of limit that blast radius. And it's far better than even the best companies in the world have built into their kind of static environment. And so what we're seeing, to your exact point, is actually the cloud is probably going to be more secure because this is usually about finding the right balance of permissioning and access controls and making sure that that is connected, and much more so than, hey, picking the best firewall and the best data leak prevent. Those are all just important tactics. And so to me, it's almost impossible to keep up with that ever changing technology stack and instead focus more on how do I express it all as a set of services that I'm just consuming very rapidly based on what my environment.
And given that things are developing rapidly in this space and the capabilities and innovation are still, if not nascent, are still in the early stages, what does Coda bring to the table? How are you adjusting your business and your business model and technologies to take advantage of this and help people better avail themselves of what this three-legged stool of the best of humans, best of agents, and best of cloud development environments can bring?
So for us, regardless of who you go with, investing in cloud development environments is going to be critical because it allows me to pick the best tool for the best job. That tool could be a human. It could be a human using AI. It could be AI. All of those. And by the way, it'll depend on sort of where you are in your journey. I think the most important thing is don't make that decision. It's a point in time decision that will change. And so making sure that I don't have to throw out my entire development stack and adopt a new one is going to be critical. And so I think where we've invested a lot of our time and energy is how do we take this concept of a development environment, which is the infrastructure, the tooling, all of the source code, everything that a developer needs to be productive, express that as code so it can be reprogrammed and rewritten on the fly, and make it so that as my needs change, I don't have to reinvent that underlying infrastructure every time. I can just simply change a variable. So Tomorrow we want to use a different IDE, the code editor. No problem. Next time you log in, it'll be there. I want to make sure that this Gen AI tool is available to all my developers. No problem. Flip of a bit. Everybody now has access. I want all developers to have access to an agent. No problem. Here's a secure sandboxed agent, already protected, already has a limited blast radius. So you, the human, don't have to worry about what it can and cannot do. Your job is just to get them up. Doing all of that in a scalable, safe way is what we bring to the table. And I think it was probably critical as we started seeing this rise in AI, but it's going to become absolute table stakes moving forward when that's just how we get work done in the modern enterprise.
It also seems to me that a lot of what can take place in development practices can then be applied to broader business practices. And so should we look to what Coder is helping organizations as development and innovation engines accomplish? Should we look for that to be a paradigm then extend to other business processes, to digital business transformation, to rethinking how you relate to all the other assets and language models and agents that will become available? So if we can do it there, sort of like the New York model, we can do it anywhere. If you can make this happen in your development organization, is this the place to then plant the seed to be able to do great things with agentic AI across your business?
Yeah, I think this is going to be an interesting defining moment for a lot of companies in terms of how they remain competitive. And why do I say that? Well, today, what is a development environment? It's really just me spinning up a series of tools to create applications. Today, that is the domain of a software engineer. And I'm setting up very specific code editors to produce code to then compile and make that application. Well, what we've seen is that there's already an adjacent set of roles where they don't identify as software engineers, but they do identify as developers. These would be data scientists that have to write scripts so they can get the most out of their data and analytics. Or maybe it's a marketer that's trying to make changes to their website. And so they're sort of not proficient in coding tools, but because of this sudden proliferation of AI tools, they don't have to be. So now I have to set development environments for these populations that I never thought of as developers before because they're not software engineers. Well, imagine taking that out even further. Now, as a line of business owner, you have a problem you're trying to solve. All I want to do is build a prototype, a solution, quickly create it, and then push it to production. There may never be another human in that loop. I may get to a point where I can go from prototype to production all on my own in one of these environments. And so for me, what was a one-to-one relationship of developer equals software engineer is now developer equals anybody with a problem that's trying to create an application. And that's going to be the vast majority of knowledge workers. And so I think all of this best practice that we've created for making a software engineer productive is actually going to apply, which by the way is about 10 to 20% of any population within a large enterprise, is soon probably going to appeal to more like 60% of people that are just trying to create applications to solve business problems. And I think that's going to be a phenomenal world where we're creating a lot more software, which is great, but it's also a terrifying world because, for example, the marketing team does not like it when I create a new website, right? Great for me, but we have some interesting learning that we'll have to go through as an industry.
Well, that could be another instance where the paradigm carries through in a positive way, that the governance, the security, the sandboxing, the permissioning based on KPIs, based on parameters that are preset will guide this new creativity, just like it would guide a software development in a traditional sense.
One of the things I think about is guardrails versus gates. I think traditionally when we rolled out a technology, we created these hard gates where things couldn't pass from A to B without having this control point. So maybe that was a developer committing code before it went into test, so on and so forth. Well, those boundaries are not going to work in a world where all of these roles are getting blurred. So the best thing I can do is take this person that's trying to solve a problem, wrap them in bubble tape so that they don't hurt themselves, and just make it as safe as possible to do that. So my mindset has to shift from, I'm not trying to put a gate in place and saying no, I'm trying to put some guardrails in place to keep you safe. And I think that's going to be a much more productive way to get the best out of all this than this world where I'll just say no all the time.
And then another aspect to this is forever we've been talking about breaking down the silos between what goes on in IT and what goes on in the business. And what you're describing with this new paradigm of agent-based development, but also innovation, inventing, engineering, coming up with solutions, the knowledge worker, given all the power of technology, that doesn't break down the silos. It basically munges together IT and the business, something that we've been talking about theoretically for a long time. So is that kind of where you're seeing it going?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll give you a real world example. So we create an open source technology at heart. And one of the things that we found was that a lot of universities want to use that. It's a great way to make student environments available for them to create software. Okay, great. Well, we don't have the right licensing for how to make things available for educational institutions. So a particularly intrepid marketer said, okay, I'm going to work with an AI agent and I'm going to say, hey, go look at our licensing page, create a third license that is a university SKU that can be available for universities only, and then update that page. Well, this agent started going through a process where it said, okay, well, I'm going to have to set up a way for you to get that license. So let me go figure out that. It broke down the problem into about 10 sub-problems and literally worked on each one in a way where this marketer who's just trying to solve a business problem of how do I make my software available to universities so that students can use it, and actually created an end-to-end solution. He didn't have to involve my engineering team. He didn't have to involve my IT team. He didn't have to involve my security team. Now, those ended up being humans that reviewed the solution, but that was a mere fraction of their time versus having to sit down and design it all and figure out all the gazintas and gozautas to figure out all the system connectivity. All of that was done iteratively with an agent. And now just imagine applying that to whatever business problem you have and just taking someone who wants to add value to the business, has the ability to talk to one of these agents in a safe way, and then just kind of unleashing them. And that's where you kind of have these serendipitous moments that you really have to experience to believe them.
Right. So I can imagine someone listening to this getting very jazzed about the potential benefits, but we don't want to get too far out in front of our skis. Let's go back to that initial quote that you had. How can organizations, or do you have any examples of organizations that are doing this as a practical way of just generating more code now? Because that often is the brass tacks that people have to live with. How do I get more code out the door? So let's, kind of go back a little bit to the basics. How is this being used? What are some examples of how it's contributing to a successful increase in productivity?
It's important to understand what tools can do what jobs really well. That will change. And if AI has proven anything, it will change pretty rapidly. But understanding those limitations and not asking too much of them. So what we see is really successful is there are tools that are really good at prototyping. And so these would be tools where they can kind of create an application. It's probably not going to be the world's most graceful code. It's probably not going to be the most secure code. It may have some vulnerabilities in it, but it will get you to working prototype pretty quickly. That would probably take me days or weeks of research as a developer. But now I have a working prototype. I can socialize it. The next thing I'm going to do is import that prototype into one of these environments where I can then almost as a pair programmer work with AI to make it better. Right. And so now I'm developing the code. I'm hardening it. I'm finding those bugs. I'm making it more graceful, more compact. So that's where sort of a longer lived project. And then ultimately, I'm probably going to have to go on to testing it, so on and so forth. And so I might create an agent that just knows how to run tests. And so I, as the developer, am not having to kind of break my flow, go figure out unit tests, write all those tests. And so I went from 3 radically different AI tools based on where I was in the software development lifecycle, a prototyping tool, a coding tool, and maybe a testing agent. And just understanding that those narrowly scoped tasks are really good for those particular things. And I'm sort of playing quarterback, passing the ball to the different players on the field as needed. Very, very different world, very different way to think about it. But ultimately, that's where that sort of soft skills are going to come in as me trying to coordinate that work. And then over time, I may get comfortable with an agent performing more and more of the core code generation, not just testing. Great. Same basic workflow, but now I'm just asking this tool to take on more and more. And I'm playing the QA engineer that's looking at that code and saying, okay, this was written well or not well. And I think we'll probably end up getting to a place where within this calendar year, that'll be the standard workflow for most developers.
Okay, one more quick question before we start to wrap up around the practical way to get started with this. Now, we use the analogy of hiring a contractor, a developer, a human to come in and do some coding, giving them the requirements and letting them come back with, the results. We would go perhaps to a human resources person to find that developer. But these aren't human resources. These are agent resources. Do we need another supply chain function, agent resources, procurement of a sort? Who does the actual interviewing and acquiring of the agent for these developers? Because that's really not what they're used to doing.
I think this will be a fascinating problem to solve. I do think there are technological ways to solve it. So one of the things that we've developed are these benchmark tests that as I run an agent through it, it produces a quality score on how well did that agent actually perform the task that I gave it. And we have some of the best software shops in the world, from Google and Meta and Tesla, creating these benchmarks, testing these tools. So I can then take advantage of that. And again, as long as I sort of keep a little bit of an abstraction, so I can just say, I want an agent. I won't specify which one. I can make a game time decision. I want an agent of this quality that has passed this level of scoring to perform this task. Now, that's pretty difficult to tie all that in. And so there's things that we have to work through. I have to think about, almost rather than interviewing and hiring a human, I'm doing that micro interview every time I spin up a development environment. And what are the trusted sources? And so we've thought a lot about this. We've tried to figure out, how do we create marketplaces and how do we create these kind of dynamic routers that automatically pull all this information? So I think it's going to be a very fun area over the next 6 months, but it's probably going to be the most critical part to get right, because if you spin up the wrong resource and it provides a bad output, you're going to say, I give up. I don't want, this wasn't what I was expecting. When in reality, it may have just been a glitch and you should have picked a different agent at a different point in time. And your competitor will, and they'll get the result and they'll go faster.
And then there's also perhaps unintended consequences around costs, like we saw with cloud at one time, that suddenly you've got too many virtual instances fired up that they're not being used very efficiently. And so we might need to revisit whether a human being is cost effective versus some of the agents. So that's all another topic for another day, is the cost benefits of agents. We're not quite there yet, but that will be an important facet as well. So before we close out, Rob, how should organizations prepare themselves for this? It sounds like we're still in formative and we're experimenting, and it's very exciting about what's possible. But how do you get yourself positioned to be able to be flexible and experimental and to take advantage of what's largely a kind of a greenfield situation?
Kind of going back to where we started, this is disruptive. And so there really is no graceful way to do this. You just have to jump in. You have to pick a part of the stack that you're willing to change, to augment with AI capabilities or replace entirely with an agent, and just start feeding it tasks and seeing how it's doing. The best examples I've seen, we set up an AI lab so that we get the technology working. We then go find a progressive set of developers within the company that are leaning into AI. They're not afraid of it, and connect them into that lab environment that I set up for them and start asking them, how was your experience? Were you able to do this task? And then once you kind of create that initial group, those pioneers that are going to determine if it's a good fit for my business, then I evangelize and roll it out at scale. I think rolling it out at scale without those pioneers, recipe for disaster. Not setting up the lab, recipe for disaster. And so I think you have to kind of treat this as, we're going to get through the red tape. We're going to get a small population using it, and we're going to use the developers to educate the other developers on why this was such a profound change to their workflow. And then the last thing I'll end on is, you cannot operate from a place of fear. If you're fear is this is going to replace humans, you're thinking about it wrong. It's how do I augment and make the human focused on bigger tasks that are more suitable for human brains versus low-level tasks that are more suitable for agentic brains. And figuring out how to do that is much better than just having a default, I'm afraid this is happening, I'm going to kind of stick it out on the sidelines for a little while. We've seen how that happens, and then we end up with a graveyard of companies that didn't figure out how to adapt fast enough.
Yeah, suffice to say that the status quo is not going to hold, so you might as well get ready for change. It's coming.
Yep.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Rob Whiteley, CEO at Coder, for joining us today. We appreciate your coming on. Where can people find some white papers, use cases, some hard data, if you will, to further their exploration of these topics?
Sure. Yep. You can just head over to coder.com. You can try the software. You can check out all the resources. Our blog is going bit by bit through our experience as we set agents loose on our code base. So if you just want to learn how we're doing, the results we're getting, all that can just be at coder.com.
And also a big thank you to our audience and everyone for listening and joining. We hope you took a lot of actionable intelligence away from today's Tech Transform discussion. For more information on the benefits of agentic AI and advancing development and IT governance, do please head over to coder.com. We'll be back next week with another episode in our podcast series. Until then, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all the major platforms and follow the conversation on our social media destinations at EM360Tech on Twitter and X, and also on LinkedIn. And for more great daily content, head over to em360tech.com. Thank you.